Greetings, everyone. We are Group 5, and we are here to discuss Rule Utilitarianism by John Stuart Mill. But, we, but before we dive in by our topic, let us first to introduce John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill was born in London in 1806 and educated privately by his father. He was known as the most significant English language philosopher of the 19th century. His father molded him into a future leader of the Bethamite movement, and from 1823 onwards, he became a member of a small utilitarian society which met at Bentham's house. He contributed to various periodicals and was a frequent orator in the London Debating Society. Among his most significant publications are System of Logic, On Liberty, Utilitarianism, and an examination of Sir William Hamilton's philosophy. Proceeding to the definition of rule utilitarianism. Rule utilitarianism stresses the recurrent features of human life and the ways in which similar needs and problems arise over and over again. From this perspective, we need rules that deal with types of classes of actions. Killing, such as killing, stealing, lying, cheating, taking care of our friends or family, punishing people for crimes, aiding people in need, and etc. This perspective, however, agree that the main determinant of what is right or wrong is the relationship between what we do or what form our moral code takes and what is the impact of our moral perspective on the level of people's well-being. Next is the concepts of rule utilitarianism. In utilitarianism, John Mill gives two different formulations of utilitarian standard. This first point in an act utilitarian and the second in a rule utilitarian direction. To summarize the second formula, which relates to the rule utilitarianism, the second formula relates the principle of utility to rules and precepts and not to actions. It seems to say that an act is correct when it corresponds to rules whose preservation increases the mass happiness in the world. And this appears to be a rule utilitarian conception. To discuss promoting long-term happiness, here is Ms. Andrade.
So Mill has emphasized long-term happiness over short-term benefits, which means creating a lasting and meaningful life for everyone involved, and not just an immediate pleasure. By establishing rules that are designed to be followed, rule utilitarianism aims to maximize happiness and focuses more on the long-term consequences. For example, following the law. Laws are generally created to maintain order and to protect our rights, which promotes general welfare and happiness to all of its citizens. According to John Stuart Mill, happiness is the ultimate goal that all human actions should aim for, and it is important to know that the happiness that we are trying to achieve is not for our own, but for the happiness of everyone involved. In Mill's view, everyone's happiness is equal, and as mentioned, rural utilitarianism is a moral theory that places a strong emphasis on following the rules that leads to the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Next. The greatest happiness principle was considered by Mill to be the foundation of morality. He argued that our actions should aim to promote the greatest possible happiness. He then expressed the idea that morality of an action is determined by its consequences, which means that our actions can be judged as morally right if it promotes happiness and morally wrong if they result in the opposite, which is unhappiness. But then he also said that none of the rules are unbreakable or absolute, because there are situations where breaking the rules promotes the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Generally, moral rules such as do not lie promotes the greatest happiness, but in some instances, lying might be morally justified if it leads to the greatest possible happiness. For example, lying to protect someone's life not only affects the happiness of the individual involved, but also the people around them, ultimately bringing joy and relief to many. Now let's proceed to the importance of justice and fairness, which will be discussed by Ms. Turno. Moral rules such as do not lie promote.
John Mill argues that actions are morally right if they conform to rules established to maximize general happiness. In his philosophy of utilitarianism, he emphasized the importance of justice and fairness in creating a just and equitable society. Mill believed that justice is the foundation of any civilized society and emphasized the protection of individual rights and freedoms. He argued that every individual has the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and justice ensures that these rights are respected and upheld. Fairness, on the other hand, ensures that these rights are distributed equitably without any discrimination or bias. He says that when people feel that they are treated fairly and justly, they are more likely to adhere to social rules and cooperate with others. And in contrast, a lack of justice and fairness can result in social unrest and conflicts. Neil also highlighted the significance of justice and fairness in the functioning of government and law enforcement. He believed that laws and institutions should be based on principles of justice and fairness. Um, he ensures that law is applied equally to all individuals, regardless of their social status or influence. And by upholding just and fair principle, we create a society where individuals are protected from harm and where their rights and freedoms are respected. This leads to a harmonious and flourishing society. And the next topic is distinction between higher and lower pleasure to be discussed by Ms. Laboste.
Another basis of happiness is higher and lower pleasure, according to John Mill. John Stuart Mill distinguishes between higher and lower pleasures in his utilitarian philosophy. He believes that happiness is the ultimate goal of life, and happiness is defined as experiencing pleasure and avoiding pain. However, Mill argues that not all pleasures are equal. Some are of higher quality than others. Higher pleasures involve intellectual and moral activities like enjoying art, literature, or engaging in deep thinking and personal growth, while lower pleasures, on the other hand, are more about physical sensations like eating or simple bodily satisfaction. Mill believes that higher pleasures are more valuable because they engage our minds and enrich our lives more deeply. Unlike Jeremy Bentham, who thought that the amount of pleasure was the only thing that mattered, Mill argues that quality matters too. Even if a lower pleasure is abundant, it's not as valuable as higher pleasure. For instance, people who have experienced both kinds of pleasure would prefer a smaller amount of higher pleasure over a large amount of a lower one. To discuss the pros and cons of utilitarianism, Miss Ivy, please take over.
Let's proceed to the discussion of pros and cons of rule utilitarianism. One of the main advantages of rule utilitarianism is that it promotes social good by adhering to rules that aim to maximize happiness or minimize harm for the majority. This approach encourages that contribute positively to society. The second one is that it fosters social stability. Since everyone follow a set of consistent, well-defined rules, there's predictability in behavior. And lastly, rule utilitarianism is appealing because there's no contradiction to moral solutions. Since rules are based on the utility principle, they aim to support moral solutions by promoting happiness and reducing suffering. Next is the cons. One significant con is that it often neglects individual circumstances since rule utilitarianism emphasizes rules that apply universally. It may overlook personal situations where a rule could cause harm or lead to unfair outcomes. Another downside is the loss of flexibility. Rule utilitarianism, like deontological ethics, requires strict adherence to rules, limiting individuals' ability to adapt to unexpected or complex situations. Lastly, while rule utilitarianism has similarities with deontological ethics in its emphasis on rules, it doesn't always account for the same rigid sense of duty as deontology. However, its reliance on rules for maximizing utility can still reduce flexibility, similar to the way deontology operates with strict moral rules. Now let's proceed on differentiating the act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. First, let's focus on act utilitarianism. Act utilitarianism is considered an extreme utilitarianism because it evaluates each situation independently and seeks to maximize happiness based on specific circumstances rather than general rules. In act utilitarianism, the primary focus is on the specific action taken in the given situation. Each action is evaluated by its actual consequence without necessarily adhering to a preset rule. While act utilitarianism may use general guidelines or rule of thumbs, this can be overridden in individual cases. Lastly, act utilitarians ask, what will the consequence be if I act like this in the specific situation? This approach assesses the actual consequence of particular action, considering the immediate outcome of the action on everyone involved. Now, for rule utilitarianism is a restricted utilitarianism because it prioritizes adherence to rules that are designed to maximize happiness in general, even if exceptions in specific cases could yield better results. Rule utilitarianism emphasizes the rule behind the action rather than the specifics of individual situation. It focuses on what should be done if everyone followed the particular rule in similar circumstances. In this view, rules must be followed under all circumstances, even if following them leads to undesirable outcomes. Lastly, rule utilitarianism asks, what will the consequence be if everyone act like this in such cases? They consider hypothetical consequence based on universal adherence to rules, focusing on the broader impact on society. Now, for the similarities, both theories aim to promote happiness and minimize suffering in moral decision making. Second, both act and rule utilitarianism are consequentialist theories, meaning they evaluate the morality of an action based on its outcomes or consequences. They emphasize that the right action leads to the best result, whether on a case by case basis or act utilitarianism, or by following general rules, which is the rule utilitarianism. Lastly, both act and rule utilitarianism emphasizes the importance of making practical and real-world ethical decisions. Now, to give examples of rule utilitarianism, may I call on Ms. Bautista?
Let's move on to rule utilitarianism examples. First is refraining from lying. Discourage lying because it damages trust and leads to deception within society. By contrast, promotes a stable foundation for relationship and well-being. Second is obeying traffic rules. Following traffic laws reduces the risk of accidents and promotes public safety. Consistent rules ensure safer roads for everyone. Third is avoiding theft. Respecting others' property rights builds trust and cooperation within a community. A society where theft is minimized is a safer, more stable place. Fourth is respecting privacy. Valuing others' privacy helps maintain trust and respect in personal and professional relationships. It supports autonomy and dignity across society. Lastly is practicing responsible consumptions. Consuming goods and sustainability protects resources for future generations. This approach also reduces harm to vulnerable communities and the environment. Next slide po. For the topic summary, first is rule utilitarianism is a moral theory developed by John Stuart Mill, which suggests that the rightness and wrongness of actions is determined by whether they follow rules that generally promotes the greatest happiness for the most people. Second is Mill distinguish between higher pleasures like enjoying art or engaging in thoughtful discussions and lower pleasures like eating or drinking. He argues that higher pleasures are more valuable because they contribute more deeply to our overall well-being. Third is both act and rule utilitarianism are based on the idea that the morality of an action is determined by its consequences. In other words, what matters most is the outcome of our action. Fourth is moral rules are essential because they help us navigate common situations and make ethical decisions, making it easier to do right thing in everyday life. Fifth is Mill encourages us to think beyond immediate gratification and focus on long-term happiness. He believes that following rules that promotes lasting well-being benefits both individual and society as a whole. Lastly is rules are essentials, but they aren't absolute. They are situations where breaking a rule can lead to a better outcome, and this flexibility is a key aspect of rule utilitarianism. So this summary highlights how rule utilitarianism encourages us to follow ethical principles that maximize well-being for society. Again, we are the Group 5. Thank you for listening.